This is CHSR 97.9 FM here in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. This is Python's Paradise, your film and music show, and this is your host, Greg Gilbert, aka the Python Hyena. And folks, I had the time of my life leaving New Brunswick for my first time last November, being Lisa Langlois' guest at Horrorama. And I met all kinds of interesting, wonderful people there, including my guest today, Mr. John Harrison of the movie Effects. How do you do, John?
I'm good, Greg. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. I know at Horrorama you gave me your information, and I don't know where that card went that you put it all down on, but.
Well, I don't know where it is either if you don't.
I know I've seen it since, too, so since I got back, so I don't know. It'll pop up somewhere, I know that.
Well, we were having too much of a good time up there, so you probably just put it down and forgot where you put it.
That's probably it. Yeah, I had a blast, and it was all that was a new experience for me because like I said, never been outside New Brunswick, and I had Lisa Langlois was on my show a couple times, and she's since become a very close friend, and she invited me to come on out to that, and I'd never flown before or traveled, and she asked me what was stopping me, and I had somebody here from the station actually say, look, you don't have this going on, go. And I was like, I've been a fan of Lisa's since the 80s, and if she invites me to be her assistant, you know what? I can't turn that down.
Well, you ended up in the big city, and it was quite an event. I think they put on a really good show up there, and I was glad to be invited myself.
I loved it. I had the time of my life at that, and it was just a brand new experience for me, and I'd never been in a city like that before. And Lisa showed me my Toronto, and it was. I've had guests before invite me to these events, and I've never ever done it. And right now, with things go with the way they are in the States, I don't know. I think I might have to wait till they get a new leader or something. I don't know. But,
well, there are a lot of great shows up in Canada. I mean, I've been to Fantasia in Montreal, and Toronto, of course, has a lot of great shows. And if you're into the genre like we are, you ought to be able to find lots of great events going on up there. And then down here, of course, there are plenty all over the country all year long. But I've had a great time in Toronto over the years, and it's a very it's a terrific city, but it's a great city for people who are into the genre. And they have the zombie walk during TIFF, and they do all kinds of great things. And my friend George Romero lived there and loved that city, and so you ought to make it a habit, man.
Oh yes, we get a zombie walk here too.
Did you?
Oh yeah, we have one every year here, and I never zombified myself, but I've been to it. George Romero, he must have been just overwhelmed at where zombies went after he made Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah, I mean they seem to be cropping up everywhere.
I wonder if he went to the zombie walks.
Oh, I think he did. I think there was the year that we did Diary of the Dead, which we produced in Toronto. They had the premiere screening at TIFF, and they had a big zombie walk then. I mean, I don't know whether he participated in it. I wasn't there for that, but I know that year that we were premiering Diary, they had a big zombie walk that year at TIFF.
Well, people love their zombies, and people get all bloodied up, and some strange-looking characters wandering around the streets during that time.
Yep,
so,
no kidding.
Yeah.
Very creative stuff, though. I mean, I'm amazed at what the fans go through, how artistic they are, and how much time and care they put into their designs. It's pretty amazing, actually.
Yeah. Have you ever been up my way before in New Brunswick, Canada?
A long, long time ago, I was there just briefly, and it was almost like kind of just a touchdown kind of a thing. So I really don't know Newfoundland that well, or New Brunswick that much. No, as a matter of fact, I really don't.
Yeah, I'm trying to introduce the world to New Brunswick, Canada, because nobody seems to know where we are. But anyway, I was wondering, before we get into your films, I wonder if you give us some of your background.
Well, not too much to say. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, and was there until I left and went off to college, and then I was on the road for a while, and I then came back and formed a small production company with two of my dear friends, and that's how we met George. He had a company as well, and we were all doing industrials and commercials in the city at the time. He had done Night of the Living Dead, so we certainly knew who he was, and he had with his then partner, Richard Rubenstein, he had a series of sports documentaries that he was doing for ABC, and we called him up and offered our services. We had some equipment, and he hired us, and it just went on from there. We became really dear friends. He became one of my mentors. I was his first assistant director on Creepshow and Day of the Dead, and performed in Night Riders, and just worked with him constantly through the 70s and into the early 80s. And then my wife and I decided that I was going to have to move out to Los Angeles, which we did in 1980. But George, by that time, and Richard had put together a television show called Tales from the Darkside. And so when I moved out there, they hired me to write and direct episodes, and I did about 4 seasons of that. And that kind of got me started in Hollywood, which was terrific. And I got an agent, and then work started happening. But I always stayed in touch with both Richard and George, and through the 90s, worked with them again. I ended up doing a big miniseries with Richard's company, New Amsterdam, called, it was an adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune, which was, we did 2 big miniseries for the Sci-Fi Channel. And like that, just kind of got started in Pittsburgh, went out to Los Angeles, had a good run, doing a lot of different genre things, worked with people both inside and outside the genre. Did a great movie with Clive Barker, Clive Barker's Book of Blood.
Yep.
A few years back, and I'm still doing it, still hanging in. So it's been a good run. No complaints.
Well, you know what? I loved Horrorama, and what a treat it was to meet Mrs. Romero herself, Suzanne. And she was on my show back in January in tribute to George Romero. It was actually my 200th interview, 200th episode. So she was happy to do that. And we talked about those little George Romero dolls.
Oh, yeah, the little plushies. We became good friends during that whole period of time. I met Suzanne in Toronto once George moved up there after Land of the Dead. Mm-hmm. And then when we were doing Diary, we spent a lot of time together because we were up there. Peter Grunwald, George's partner, and I moved up to Toronto for that production, and lots of great times just hanging around George's apartment or on the set. That was always the fun part of being with George, because we both had love of movies, and we would talk about all kinds of things, and over a bottle of scotch just end up into the wee hours just laughing about all kinds of stuff. And he had a great personality, very wonderful, warm guy, And so even though that movie was one of the smaller Dead movies in George's oeuvre, I happen to like it a lot. And but it's also one of the great experiences of my career, just being up there again with him after all those years, working again together, and just hanging out for the however much, the year that we were making that movie. It was just great.
Yeah, yeah. I just had two just after Suzanne. This February, I had Judith O'Dea on from Night of the Living Dead, and it's like, yeah, I've talked a lot of Night of the Living Dead just this year alone, and she's somebody I think they should reach out to get at Horrorama. I think she'd be a major draw for something like that. She was wonderful.
I didn't know Judith very well. I think we've met a couple of times in the Berg. But that whole crew, Carl and Judy and all of the guys, Russ Striner and Jack, all the guys that worked on Night, that predated me. I was away at college when they were making that movie, and I heard about it while I was living in Boston. And hey, there were these guys in Pittsburgh, and they made this horror movie, and it's so cool. And I went to see it, and of course, yeah, I thought it was really cool, and it was very inspirational because I figured, well, look, if these guys from my hometown can do this, maybe I can too. And so when I went back to Pittsburgh, I made it a point of meeting them. But that was sort of pre my involvement with George, so I didn't know all of them that well.
How does somebody like you went to Horrorama? How did you get involved with that? Like, how did they get you for something like that?
Well, Chris Alexander, who runs Horrorama, he actually approached me at George's funeral and said, "Hey, look, the new one's coming up, and I'd love to have you participate and come up." And I knew Chris because of Day of the Dead and his magazines and his writing and so forth, and I knew that he was a good friend of George's. Mm-hmm. And so when he asked me to do it, I said, "Well, yeah, I'd be happy to do it." And so that's how that happened. I had been up to the Fantasia Fest in Montreal a few years before with Book of Blood.
Okay.
That was the North American premiere of that film, and so I was kind of familiar with the things that go on in Canada, but I had never been invited to any. Well, I was invited to Fantasia, but I hadn't been invited to the other Horrorramas. So when Chris asked me, I thought, well, okay, this is a great opportunity, and gave me a chance to go up and hang with Suzanne again, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, they didn't have Suzanne on the poster, so that was what was a shock when I think it was you that told me that Romero's widow was there, and I was like really, I had to go meet her, and she gave me her information, and she was so polite, and yeah, it was just an honor. But yeah, when I was at Horrorama, I went to a couple of the screenings there, and one of those screenings was to a little movie I actually had not heard of prior to this called Effects, and I never heard of it, and I looked it up online before I went to Toronto, and I was like, oh, wow, it's an older film, and I love going to the older films, and this is a chance to see something like this screened, where a lot of times it might get lost in the shuffle, but I actually really enjoyed your little movie there. Then, and of course you had a part in it, and I watched it. I know you signed my Blu-ray copy, and yeah, I actually really enjoyed it. It was it was not done on a huge budget, but.
No.
Yeah, but you know what, though? That was part of its charm.
Well, that was back in the day when we were all just... there was a period of time in Pittsburgh and around the country, actually, when in the early 70s there, where there really was an independent filmmaking milieu, if you want to call it that. There was George in Pittsburgh and Toby down in Texas and Wes out on the West Coast, and then Sam Raimi started to do stuff in Detroit, and all of this was really independent filmmaking. There was no Miramax, there was no Sony Classics, there was no Fox Searchlight. You really went out and by hook and by crook, you begged, borrowed, stole whatever you needed to get to make a movie. And remember, this is back in the days of celluloid. There was no digital production at that time, so it was a very, in some ways, a lot more difficult to put a production together than it is today, where you can actually shoot a movie on your iPhone. But we all were determined to do it, and people like George were very inspirational because he had done it. He'd done exactly that. He'd gone out and just borrowed money from his friends and got the equipment together and went off with his friends and made the movie. And we decided we would do the same thing, and that was Effects. And my partner and dear friend Dusty Nelson directed it. And as you say, we didn't have a very big budget, so
yeah, but you know what? That was part of its charm.
I was the guy with the piano, so I did the music.
Yep.
And I'd gone to theater school, so I did one of the parts. We had Tom Savini and Joe Pilato, and for a long time, it got a very little bit of distribution when we first finished it, and it was mostly drive-in theaters in the Southwest and so forth. And like all these things, you know, it wasn't a great deal, and the company that did it didn't have a lot of money. So after that, it just kind of fell by the wayside, and people knew about it, but they hadn't seen it. And around 2005, I was at a signing out in L.A., and a guy came up to me and said, "Whatever happened to this cult film called Effects? You know, we keep hearing about this, and it was sort of you guys and the whole Romero era and everything, and but nobody can find it." And I basically told him the story, and he said, "Well, you know, I have a friend at Anchor Bay. Maybe they'd be interested." So we started chatting, and that turned out to be a fellow by the name of Michael Felsher.
Okay.
Another good friend of George's and mine, and he runs a company called Red Shirt Films. He had left Anchor Bay and was working with Synapse. And Synapse, the guys at Synapse got in touch with me through Michael, and they said they would like to put it out on DVD. So lo and behold, you know, 30-some-odd years later, this movie now has a life on DVD. And then last year, after that license ran out, and last year the people down in Austin at the Alamo Draft House called me up and said, "Look, we have this company called the America Genre Film Archives, and we restore and preserve old horror movies, and we have found a print of Effects." And I have no idea how they found this print. I think it was just left behind in some old storage facility from back in the day. And they said they wanted to do a 4K Blu-ray of restoration. And we licensed it to them, and that's the one that you have now, Greg. And that's the one that we screened up at Horrorama. But it just kind of blows my mind that 40 years after we made this movie, it's finally getting more distribution than it did when we first made it.
You mentioned Draft House. It's interesting because they redistributed one of my favorite vigilante films, Ms. 45.
Oh yeah, I mean they're fantastic. The guys down there. First of all, the theaters are really wonderful. I don't know whether you've been to any of them, but they're great places to see movies because you can sit and order food and have drinks, and they're very respectful of the movies. And they have wonderful things like Horror Tuesdays and Thriller Wednesdays, and they show all these wonderful old movies. They're all around the country now. And they're in the business of preserving films, and they did just a fantastic job. They invited us down to Austin to screen it to a sold-out house, and people. It just, as I say, Greg, it just blows my mind that people even know about this movie so long after it was made. But there it is.
Well, I made a point. I attended 2 screenings. The other one was Brain Damage.
Oh, yeah.
And it was like, I knew I was going to be helping Lisa. I was so honored to be her assistant at this. But there was a couple of screenings I knew I wanted to see. And Effects, like I said, I hadn't heard of it. So before I went to Toronto, I looked it all up. And I got to say, it just shows what you can do with a limited budget, And I like the story of the film. I really loved the whole idea of the snuff film references it makes,
Sure.
Between reality and film.
Well, it was based on a book that another friend of ours had written, a fellow by the name of William Mooney, and the book was called Snuff, and Dusty adapted the book, and but as I say, back in the day, we all kind of did everything because that was just the way it worked. None of us went to film school, so we never came out as, oh, okay, he's the director, or he's the writer, or he's the cinematographer. We all did a bit of everything because that's the way you got things done. And so it was a wonderful experience to make that movie. We obviously learned a lot by doing it, but just the experience of putting together a narrative, a full-length feature narrative, and having it play was really quite exciting. When you're young, you're fearless, and you don't think anything can stand in your way, and it's a good thing because we didn't know what we didn't know.
One of the most disturbing scenes in the movie is where you guys are watching a snuff film that your character apparently made, and you get this woman tied to a chair and being sliced up. And to me, that scene is the pivotal scene in the movie that really tells what the movie is about.
Well, it is. Of course it is. And it, as you say, it plays with the whole concept of what is real and what isn't real. Mm-hmm. And, of course, that wasn't real, although I have to tell you that when it came out, it was a very controversial scene, and there were a lot of people who refused to believe that it wasn't real, and we took a lot of heat for that. We were at a film festival, the precursor to Sundance out in Utah, mm-hmm. and it was then called the U.S. Film Festival in Salt Lake City, and the next year it became Sundance when Redford took it over. Mm-hmm. But we were one of the finalists, and we were kind of vilified by a lot of the audiences. They just were like horrified by this thing, and they couldn't quite see past the their revulsion of it to the point that the film was trying to make.
Well, you weren't.
That was partly done by, that was obviously Dusty's talent in the way he shot it, but it was also Tom Savini's talent in the way he staged it and the special effects that he used. And it's really pretty tame when you consider stuff that's on the screen now. It's the context that makes it so horrifying. Because you have these three guys sitting there watching this movie with these drooling eyes and saying, well, wait a minute, is this real or not real? And the possibility that it's real and they're still enjoying it is terrifying. Mm-hmm. But the actual violence in it is not all that much by comparison to what you see these days.
Oh, yeah, I know. Well, you guys weren't doing Cannibal Holocaust, so
No, we weren't.
Yeah.
That was a whole different
I've never seen I've never seen Cannibal Holocaust, and I don't think I want to after what I heard about how certain animals were treated on that film.
I haven't heard that, but
though there was some animals that were killed for real during the shoot.
Yeah, that wouldn't appeal to me.
Yeah, so that film didn't appeal to me, but I know that Effects was making a statement. Nobody was really, hurt, but I loved it. It's almost to me like it was a crew making this movie, but it almost seemed like a camp out of a group of friends getting together, and certain people in there are not in on what's going on because they become a pawn to certain dangers in filmmaking.
Well,
and
without going into too many spoilers, I mean, but the fact is, it was a camp out. We were all living up at that place,
mm-hmm.
and we were all living there, shooting all day, and editing and living in this place. The funny thing is that the lead actress, at the end of the shoot,
mm-hmm.
was driving we bought Joe Pilato a car. That was his payment.
Okay.
And it was just a cheap old little Triumph sports car. And they would drive back and forth. He would bring Susan Chapek up from the
mm-hmm.
city to where we were in the mountains of Pennsylvania. And on the way back after filming, they were going home after wrap, and they were coming through. There's a big tunnel in Pittsburgh called the Squirrel Hill Tunnels that come in from the east side into the city.
Mm-hmm.
And they were going through the tunnel, and all of a sudden the car broke down and started to smoke. And Susan told us later, she said, and it broke down in the tunnel, she said, I had this really sinking feeling that that you guys had actually put a camera in that car and it was going to blow up.
Oh.
It's like, because the whole movie is about my character Lacey having hidden cameras everywhere on the
mm-hmm.
property of the film while people are getting killed making this movie. And she said there was just that split second where I thought, whoa, maybe these guys are really doing that.
Yeah, you play Lacey, and what made you decide to play that character? What drew you to play? Because that's a really interesting character in the movie.
Well, again, that was one of the happenstances of being in the low-budget DIY kind of era that we were living in. We were bringing in people in the early stages. We were bringing in people to audition, and since I had a theater background, an acting background, I would be the one that would read with them for our screen tests, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, I can't remember exactly where, we had cast Joe, we had cast Susan, Debbie, I think, was cast by that point, Barney. I think we were pretty much all there, except for the character of Lacey. And Pat and Dusty came up to me one day and they said, hey, look, we've been watching you read with these other guys. Why don't you just do the part? And I thought, well, okay, it'll save the actor fee.
Yeah, and of course you had Tom Savini in this in one of his early films. Just curious, does he still have the hat from the bar?
I don't think he does, but Pat Booba found one and sent it down to Texas when we were doing the screening in Austin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he has one now.
I heard that Savini's been responsible for the rubber band wars at the conventions.
Oh, yeah, well, Tom's a character.
Yeah, well, yeah, Tom is one of these fellas that can take something what appears to be really small and turn it into something extraordinary, because he had done Martin, he had done Dawn of the Dead, and Friday the 13th, right around the time that he did effects. And Tom is a real jewel when it comes to taking a film and making it look more expensive than it is.
Well, he's an artist, and
yep.
He certainly honed the craft of what he did, and he's really kind of the gold standard. His protege, Greg Nicotero, of course, now has K&B Effects and does massive movies all over the world, and Walking Dead, and
mm-hmm.
they've won Oscars and everything. But Tom was the one that kind of originated that level of artistry in this work, along with guys like Rob Bottin and those guys. Tom was more in the gore area or in the horror area, But his work was, we used to marvel at how he would come up with, George would have these gags in the script, and he'd say, well, Tom, how are we going to do this? And then Tom would come back a couple days later with designs and ideas and elaborate on what George had written, and just phenomenal success with the way these things looked. I mean, we were talking about how effects seemed real to people, but Tom's stuff was like anatomically correct, and it's fantastic stuff. He has a school now in Pittsburgh where he's training another generation of people to do this kind of work. It's art.
Yeah, and I understand he's got a great sense of humor, so I would imagine you probably have some stories of him around the set goofing around, huh?
Well, his shop was always the source of quite a lot of hilarity.
Yeah. No, but it's funny you mentioned Joseph Piletto and getting the car. It put me in mind of Friday the 13th, because that's kind of how they paid Betsy Palmer too.
Yeah, well, I mean that was it back in the day, you know. There was some room and board and maybe a couple of bucks, and that was it.
Yeah. Well, no, Tom was wonderful in that film, and I'm going to tell you one of my favorite sequences in the film. And I think one of the reasons it drew me is because it involved a male where normally it would involve a female. But it involved a chase in the woods, and there was so much tension to it, and I was on the edge of my seat watching this because, you know, there was an injury involved, and I love that sequence and that whole survival, and again, it's where you took, you know, where you had a limited budget and you turned something great out of it, and I like that sequence a lot without giving anything away.
Well, I have to hand it to Dusty, who was the director on that. He had it all plotted out in his mind, and as a cinematographer himself, he was running around with the camera. A lot of that's handheld, as you probably know, and chasing Joe around the woods and doing these shots, and really having plotted it out in his mind in terms of what shots he would need to create the kind of tension you're talking about. And then on top of that, being able to have the live action of us following Joe around the woods and knowing that there are these guys out there shooting at him, but also then cutting back into the control room, Lacey's control room, where he's got the video set up when he's watching this on video, and is directing basically the action to drive Joe back to where he wants him to be for the finale. And Dusty really had it all mathed out in his head, and I really have to hand it to him, because those couple of days of shooting, given the fact that we were, again, with film, we had a limited amount of film to shoot, and we had a limited amount of time to get it done. He had to really have it organized and just run and gun, go from here to here to here to here to here, and end up with enough footage, the correct footage, so that when we got back into the editing room, we could build that sequence. And you're right, it's a really terrific sequence.
Yes, I was quite impressed with that. Talk a little bit about Joseph Piletto and Susan Chapnick and some of the other cast members in it, because I don't know a whole lot about them. I know some of Joseph because I know he's featured in another one of the. Let me see what I got him listed for. I know he's featured in
Day of the Dead.
Day of the Dead, that's right. He's featured in that as well. Talk about working with these actors.
Well, Joe actually was in Pittsburgh with a very famous Polish director named Jerzy Grotowski.
Okay.
And they were doing workshops in Pittsburgh, and that's how we met Joe. He became part of the theater scene in Pittsburgh. Susan was in the University of, I believe it was either Pitt or Carnegie Mellon. I think it was Carnegie Mellon. She was in the theater department there. Deborah Gordon was another actress that we knew. She had studied at Northwestern, but she was from Pittsburgh, and she had come back. Same with Barney McKenna. These were all people that were just in the theater scene in Pittsburgh. And so when we were doing the movie, we went to those people and auditioned them to try. Dusty had seen Susan in several shows at CMU. We knew of Joe from his work with Grotowski's thing. I knew Barney and Debbie, and so we just auditioned them and put the crew around, put the cast around that. Tom, of course, from his work with George and Martin and all those things. And so it just ended Day. Dawn. We hadn't done Day yet, and that's how we put it together. So it was really just pulling actors out of the local theater scene, and obviously we weren't going to go to Hollywood and hire stars or do any of that kind of thing. We just wanted really good actors,
and you got them.
Yeah, you
got them. And you went on to, I know you're a composer for a lot of films, and of course Creepshow, very, very popular, and you had speaking of big cast, you had some big cast members in that one. I got the biggest cast George worked with.
Well, I mean, again, that was kind of a matter of happenstance. I had been a musician for a lot of my early career, been on the road for a while, and before I decided that I was going to devote myself entirely to filmmaking, and I came back to Pittsburgh. And when we were doing effects, I was the guy with the piano, and I had other musician friends in town because of my career doing that, and so I got them together, and that's how we did that score. And when we were doing Creepshow, George asked me to be his assistant director, and I did, and we would sit on the set and talk about what the music should be. The original plan was to use library cues because George had done a lot of his movies that well, and he was a fantastic music editor.
Mm-hmm.
But when we got them, they really didn't live up to the quality of the movie he was making, essentially. Fidelity-wise and also just cue-wise, they didn't fit the film as well as we wanted to. And so I had some gear, and I said, look, I can enhance some of this stuff, or I can create some segues and some bridge work and stuff like that. Turns out that I ended up scoring about 80% of the movie. Just one thing led to the next, and then, of course, that became... when he decided to do Day, he just asked, well, look, man, why don't you just do the score? So I did. And then with my movie, Tales from the Darkside, the same thing. So it was really a matter of circumstance more than me setting out to have a career as a film composer, but I'm really grateful that the scores are so popular. I mean, they've been re-released over the years many times, and they're now out on vinyl, and so it's pretty fantastic, actually.
Yeah, that I think it was Suzanne was telling me that Creepshow was the probably the biggest cast that George Romero worked with, and I was wondering, did you have any interaction with them, or?
Oh, well, sure, as his AD all the time, because it was my job to make sure they got to the set, made sure they knew what we were doing next, run the set when we were there, that kind of stuff. So sure, yeah, I had a lot of interaction with them.
Who made an impression on you?
Well, they were all great, and they all were different in terms of personalities. We spent a lot of time with Leslie Nielsen, who was hysterically funny.
Suzanne said George just loved him.
Oh, he was just outrageous. I mean, we would go out to dinner with him a number of times, and he had this little fart machine that he was always blowing off. It was like... And here's this, he was a matinee idol in the early part of his career, and then he had this great career as a comedian later. He was just a terrific guy. And E.G. Marshall, the same thing. He was very, very funny. All serious actors, Hal Holbrook and Fritz Weaver, they came to Pittsburgh to work on this horror movie.
Mm-hmm.
And these are guys that are Oscar nominees and have worked in all these fantastic movies. None of them came in and acted like they were slumming it. All of them came and were working as hard as if it was a Hitchcock movie or some kind of fantastic Hollywood movie. They took it as seriously as if it were that. And total pros.
I've had Adrienne Barbeau on here 3 years ago as well, so I like her a lot as well.
Well, she's a sweetheart.
Yeah, she
Adrienne is just a a wonderful woman, and George and she were very close, and yeah, she was terrific in that role.
Yeah.
And she's not at all like that.
No, no, no. I was so honored. I had her on here in November of 2015, and she was just lovely to talk to. She was doing a play at the time, so it was great to talk to her.
She's a sweetheart.
Yeah. And in Creepshow, of course, right around that time, you mentioned Knight Rider, and you got to work in that as well. And, of course, Ken Forsey in that from Dawn of the Dead. And I love the fact that George will reuse actors, and, people he gets good work out of. And Knight Rider, I guess, was one of his more expensive projects he did.
I don't know about that. I mean, I guess it's... it sure seems that way because it looks that way on film, but I don't know that it would have been more expensive than Creepshow. I don't think it would have been.
I think it came out before Creepshow.
Oh, it did. It did.
I mean, at that time.
Oh, at that time.
Yeah,
probably.
I guess I should have clarified that.
Yeah, no, and it was one of George's favorite movies. I mean, it was a real labor of love for him.
Yeah, and I actually have not seen Knight Rider. I certainly am familiar with it. I know Tom Savini is in it. But talk about, you mentioned you acted in it.
Well, I had a small role as one of the knights.
Okay.
And it was a period, again, putting together the cast on that. Nobody knew who Ed Harris was.
Oh yeah,
This is one of his first movies, and look at him now.
Yep.
But, George really just wanted really good actors, and he cast the knights on both sides, the good and the bad knights, with people he knew, actors that he knew, and he asked me to play the role of Sir Pellinor, and it was a small role, but I was happy to do it.
He should have got John Cleese to play the Black Knight.
Yeah, that would have been. That would have added a little levity to the situation.
A little Holy Grail humor in there. Yeah. No. And of course, Day of the Dead. You were a composer on that, and again heightened those gore effects up. Talk about your experience on that.
Well, it started off with a different script, of course, and this is kind of everybody knows this story. George had a much bigger version of that, some of which ended up being incorporated or repurposed in Land of the Dead, which is the movie he did for Universal years later. But because George was very adamant that his Dead movies go out unrated, he was not in favor of the MPAA slapping an R or an X even on his movies for violence and gore. He thought that was just not fair for the audiences that love these kinds of movies. However, the distributor felt, well, if it's going to be, if it's got to go out unrated, which was George's intention, then I can't put as much money into it because the distribution is going to be more limited. So with that in mind, George had to cut down the script to a much more manageable production to fit the budget that he was then allowed to have. So that's how we ended up in the cave and doing it there. But when we were going through that process, in the early versions, he and I had been talking about the music, and it had a much bigger presence in the Caribbean than in Florida. So I'd started doing some musical sketches for him, and some of those had a kind of a Caribbean flavor to them. When we then started to make the smaller version, he still liked those themes, so we kept them, and that's how that score evolved. And it just became kind of a rock opera, actually, because I came back to the Berg after we finished shooting. He had been doing some editing for a while, and he said, look, instead of temping this with other people's music, why don't you just come back and camp out downstairs and write the music while we're editing, And it was a great experience. Normally, you don't have that opportunity as a composer. You're given the cut film, and you score to that. In this case, I was writing all the way through the post-production, and so I would be able to compose cues, and I had my own gear, so I could run stuff upstairs. We could lay it up against the picture, see what was working, what wasn't working, and then as he changed the picture, as things became edited and changed, I could make adjustments in the score. So it just turned out that I wrote a ton of music for that movie, and it was almost all scored, and he loved it. You know, it was a little counterintuitive, Greg. It was not sort of a typical horror score, and I guess, I didn't know this, but some people said it was pretty controversial when it first came out. People didn't like it that much. They thought, well, wait a minute, this music isn't scary. It's more lyrical, and so, but that was George's and mine intention, to kind of sometimes go against picture and give it a little bit more emotional oomph than just going for the scares all the time.
Sure.
So it seems it's popular now, so I guess it works out in the long run.
Yeah. And of course, you got to direct Tales from the Darkside, the movie. I got to ask you about, you had Deborah Harry in that. What was that like, working with her?
That was fantastic. Well, that was really the producers who kind of pulled that one off.
Yeah.
And they said, how about Debbie to do this? And she was not really an actress, but man, was she game. She was really willing to put herself out there and try it, and it was just a lot of fun. We had a great time on that movie.
She was great in Videodrome too, so.
Oh yeah.
Yep. So yeah, I know, and of course you got early stuff out of Steve Buscemi, Julianne Moore, Christian Slater. Yeah.
Overall, Christian had a bit of a reputation by then because he'd done Heathers and he'd done a few other things.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
He had done one of the first, when he was a kid, he had done a Tales from the Darkside, and Richard called him up and said, hey, man, come on and do this. And so he felt he was happy to come back. But, yeah, Julianne was like one of her first movies, if not her first movie. I'm not sure. Steve, same way. And, oh, man, they were great to work with.
Yeah, like look where they are now.
Yeah, man.
Yep. And I know you were involved with the TV show, so I guess that's how you got the directing part of that. Did you enjoy going behind the director's chair to do the movie version of this?
I was skeptical at first because I didn't really know how much they were going to put into it. But as it turns out, they gave me the resources that I needed to do a really good job. I had a wonderful cinematographer on it and a wonderful editor. My team was really strong, and we were able to put a design together for that piece. It was inevitably going to be compared to Creepshow and other anthologies, but it had such a great fan base, and so I took it on willingly. I was nervous about it, but we ended up, I thought, making a great little anthology horror movie, and it won the Grand Prix over at Avoriaz in France. And, so it did really well, and I'm proud of it. It still holds up. It plays every Halloween. Still out there.
Yeah, and you had mentioned Diary of the Dead, which, I mean, brings you again back with George Romero. And that one didn't get a release here. I know Land of the Dead did, but yeah. I
don't know what the Weinsteins did with that. I don't think they really came after George and Peter to get it. They wanted it, and then I just don't think they pushed it as much as they had promised they were going to, and I think that was a little disappointing.
Yeah. And, of course, Book of Blood, working with Clive Barker, and, of course, Doug Bradley. Of course, they did the Hellraiser movies. Oh, yeah.
Well, I love doing that, and I had a great time. We shot it in Edinburgh, and, again, it didn't get the distribution that I hoped it would. Partly it was a financial thing because we finished it, and it was right when the financial crisis happened in 2008, 2009,
Mm-hmm.
and the money people wanted their money back, so they made a not a very good deal for it just to get their money out of it. I kept saying, put it on the shelf, man. Just leave it for a year. This will turn around, and then. But I'm still very proud of that movie. I think it's really creepy. It is exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to do a movie that was much closer to the old Val Lewton type style of suspense and horror, and and Clive was incredibly supportive,
Mm-hmm.
and we had a great cast and a great production team in Edinburgh. It was fantastic. I loved it.
What was it like working with Doug Bradley?
Wonderful. I mean, he was a great guy. He only had the one scene, and but he was terrific, and I was happy to have him. I was happy that he could be part of it.
Yes. Well, you had done Horrorama, and you said you'd done some other conventions. Is there anything really unique you've ever been asked to sign?
Anything unique I've been asked to sign?
Like, I get people that will say, I think it was Caroline Munro was telling me that she finds it odd when people ask her to sign their skin, and then she'll see them later and it's they're tattooed on them.
Yeah, no, I that has not happened to me. Mostly it's just, I've got this picture, or I've got this poster, or I've got this album. So, and that's fine. That's fine with me.
Yeah. What do you think, because you're involved a lot in the horror genre, I get really, really tired of hearing when something violent happens in society, violent films get blamed, and I think that is such a cop-out. I heard a group recently, a group that has blocked me because I deliver reasoning and they deliver nonsense, but they were talking about the whole school shooting in Florida and the kids marching, and they think that rather than march against the NRA, people should be marching to Hollywood to take care of sex and violence. And I'm like, are you kidding me?
Yeah, I don't really subscribe to that notion. I think, unfortunately, there are people that have serious mental problems that are going to do terrible things, and whether they've seen a horror movie or not is not going to turn somebody into a mass killer. I suppose you could say there's a coarsening of our culture in some ways, but I don't put horror movies in that category. I think that they're make-believe and they're fantasies, and I think good horror. I'm not talking about slasher movies. I'm not a huge fan of slasher movies, but good suspenseful horror can often be metaphorical, and if it's done really well, if you think of the great ones, they have something to say beyond the chills and the thrills, and so I don't subscribe to the notion that going to see violent movies is going to make you violent.
I agree. I'm the same way. I think sometimes these people are just doing it for publicity. These people that drum that up.
Yeah, and besides, you can see as much violence on the nightly news as you do in any movies. I mean, come on.
Yeah, that is very true. That is very true. Well,
I don't think one has promoted the other.
No.
If anything, it's art imitating what is on the nightly news instead of the other way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's scary out there. Well, you know what? It was an honor to meet you in Toronto, and get to see effects screened there, and got a nice signed copy of the movie, and to meet Suzanne, and John Russo was there, and you guys had a nice little section over there on that side of the room. Did you get yourself a George Romero plushie doll?
Oh, yes, I have a plushie. I have my kids, each one has one.
I'm going to have to get in touch with Suzanne and get one myself,
Definitely. They're great.
Yeah. Well, I like the thick black glasses and the gray hair, you know.
Mark. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Although Suzanne said that when he was out and about, you know, he never had that look. Be too recognizable.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, John, I appreciate so much you coming on here and talk to me today, and
No, it's my pleasure.
Yeah, and talking about effects. I really enjoyed that movie, and I really appreciate it, and I'm glad that Chris Alexander had approached you and screened that, because, like I said, I hadn't heard of it, and because it was one of these older films, I was like, it was a good opportunity to see something with an audience that I normally probably wouldn't see around here, So that was wonderful.
Right, and I'm glad you did see it with an audience. It's probably more fun to see with an audience,
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Well, I was wondering if before you go, if you mind doing a plug for my show.
Oh, sure, yeah. All right, anytime?
Anytime.
Hey guys, this is John Harrison, and I just want to tell you that I'm here with Greg Gilbert and his Python's Paradise out of New Brunswick, Canada. Fantastic show. Tune it in.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John. And, it was an honor having you on, and I appreciate the honor of meeting you. I hope that I see you at one of these other conventions.
Me too. Well, listen, thanks, Greg. I appreciate it, and I enjoyed talking to you.
Absolutely. You take care, and you stay out of the snowy cold.
Yeah, exactly, man. Spring can't come too soon.
Absolutely.
All right, man.
You take care.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Yep, bye.